creating NURBs, I'll actually convert them to polys first. So let me just throw in like a real sketchy, actually, this will be a fun demo because I was actually planning on doing this later anyway. So I'm going to do a goofy thing. At some point today, I'm going to show you how to make a UV, where am I going with this? Neon sign, if for some reason you guys want to do that. So for NURBs, there's also this pencil tool, which is kind of cool. So like you can just be like, hello, yes. And you can like literally just draw and it'll make you a NURBS curve. You can also sort of smooth this out because like this looks really crazy right now, and you'll see that there's a lot of, God, sorry, buttons. I need to like hide some of this stuff. This is ridiculous. Select my curve. There we go. So you can see that there's like an absolutely ridiculous number of control points in this. So one thing you can do, and this is actually not a terrible idea to do on extruded cables and stuff like you had for the assignment this week. But if you grab the curve, oh, I'm sorry, hang on, someone's coming for a package. Hi. Have a great day. I'm sorry, I'll be back in 2 seconds. Aha. Okay. Sorry. Ow. It's a fun story. When I was building my computer, my first motherboard was broken, and that was the guy coming to take away the return first motherboard. Anyway. Okay, so, sorry. So this should be, like I said, this has a lot of points in it, and what you can do is go to curves and rebuild. And this, like I said, is also pretty good for, you know, if you're adding like twist or something like that to a cable, which probably a lot of you guys didn't really deal with, but it's not a terrible idea to do at some point. But basically what I'm going to do is do uniform, and just, these are more or less the settings I use, and then the numbers of points is going to be how many points or like, you know, little areas on this curve do I want defining the shape. So if I set this to something like 11, you can see it's basically gone through and made like 11 control points. And it looks really terrible. This is like the absolute laziest scribble signature ever. So basically for this, for something like the pencil tool, I'm just going to go through and kind of pick a random number that I think does a good job of maybe like defining the text, while also, you know, preserving a little detail of like the loopies and the L and stuff like that. Alright, so that is, you know, just a weird tidbit that I was going to do with NURBs anyway. And then for actual UV curves, so I usually recommend going through and I'm gonna go ahead and extrude this. I will usually, if you're gonna UV it, would recommend ooh, these are the wrong settings. Hang on. Alright. Oh my god. It's not infinitely better that Chrome is just like, I'm hiding all your notifications! Okay. So, Nope. So this is one of those weird things where oftentimes I will usually just sort of randomly tick settings until I get something that looks kind of reasonable. Oh, right! Because I re-downloaded Maya, it hasn't saved like any of my preferences. Wow. Okay. This is fun. This is good. Anyway. That's fun. So that explains why this looks insane right now, because I used to have my preferences set up and now I don't. Alright, so let me just do, this is usually what I do, I believe. Path direction. Alright. We're just gonna run with this for now, even though it looks a little bit crazy. So, anyway, one thing you can do, NURBS curves oftentimes don't like these really extremely hard angles with it. This is actually one of those times where I would imagine that if I were to go in and rebuild this curve with more spans, it would help a little bit with that insane flipping that is going on. Or it'll make it significantly worse, one of the two. Anyway, so like I said, I'm going to ignore that for now. But what I would normally do if I am trying to UV this is convert it to polys. So all you should need to do for that is go in and do modify, convert, NURBS to polygons. And there's a few settings in here that I usually tick. First of all, I will set this to quads because I hate triangles. The other thing that I will often do is, I believe I will set this to control points and hit apply. So when I do that, it's given me, it looks spiky and terrible, but if I hit 3, it pretty much smooths down to be exactly what the other original NURBS curve is. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that NURBS surface, and the nice thing about this is that I am still able, if I go in and I change this curve, it's still going to modify the polygons accordingly. So that's normally what I would do for that. And then you should be able to just sort of UV this like a normal object. I would actually imagine that... I imagine these UVs are going to be catastrophically awful, but if I were to planar map this and just sort of cut down the side of this object, and just do a cut, boop, and a modify unfold, it should probably give me really weirdly long UVs, but, you know, very, very nice UVs with minimal seaming. So that's probably how I would do UVs for, like, most curves and stuff like that. And then the only time that you would ever end up, like, the one thing that I will pay attention to oftentimes with NURBS curves is not deleting history on the object. It's like one of the few times that I would want to do that. So that would be anything from, you know, deleting the object will basically, like, duplicate, or, sorry, what am I saying? Sorry, duplicating the object will basically delete history. So that if I were to modify this curve, if I were to modify this curve here, you can see like this is still changing, but this one's not. And then actually deleting history on the object, so doing like an edit, delete by type, and history. I believe you can also, actually I don't know if that would work, but there is a separate option for deleting non-deformer history, but in this case this will also delete the history on the curve. So just like a weird tidbit, again, probably not the end of the world for any of you guys. You can also at any point go through, like if any of this is like flipping really weird, you could go in and manually try to fix this. But in this case, it's not something that I'm overly concerned about since this is just a random demo. So did that sort of answer your question about UVing NURBS curves?
Yeah, I think my problem was that I was generating it as polygons instead of as NURBS.
Oh, gotcha.
It. It just made a bunch of really wacky tries.
Oh, yeah. So, like, if you were doing, an extrude... Oh, yeah. I actually kind of forgot that you were able to do that. So I think what you'd probably... Okay, I don't know why that was grayed out 4 seconds ago. It seemed like clicking this and unclicking it brought these up. Oh, God. That's objectively the wrong setting. What did I just do? Curve range, complete polygons. Oop. Weird? Yeah, bizarre.
I think you have them selected in the wrong order.
Say again?
I think you have them selected in the wrong order, like you're taking the hello and putting it around the circle.
That's entirely possible. That does, yep, you are correct. I'm a dingus. Yeah, so I mean, that should give you pretty much the same effect, and then for the, let's see what we have for the UVs. Okay, gross. Alright, so I'm gonna do the same thing I did before, where I think a planar map is usually a pretty easy way to do this. And then this time I'm gonna maybe hide the seam on the back, because it seems like it would make more sense. And just do a cut there. Modify, fold. So it seems like that works pretty much the same way as it did before. Yay, okay. I think my monitor connection's loose, but later problems. The only thing I can see maybe making that a little bit weird is that if you wanted to go in somewhere like in here and then like change the buttons, arg, um, sorry, I should really like make some of this stuff display layers. Oop. All right, there we go. So the only thing that sometimes maybe would be weird, like, is if you were to change that, it shouldn't change the UVs, but like every once in a while, like it seems like it might be kind of like mushing them around a little bit. Um, so was that what you were trying to do, or was it just coming up as like super broken for you?
Yeah, but I think it was just because I made it try.
Yeah, that would do it. Tries to make everything terrible to UV. Um, but yes, I mean, if that's I think if you want to take a look at that, I'd be glad to look at it after class. But that's random demo on how I normally UV stuff. Um, but yeah. So were there any other questions before we hop into other things? Cool, cool. In that case, I'm going to go ahead and I am actually just going to delete history on this and just get rid of all these curves. I will save this for a later demo object. Yay. Um, hello. Okay, so this week I wanted to go over some stuff about texturing, just like a few more basically additional things that you might want to be aware of. So basically I'm going to go through and just sort of reset up the scene for you guys. Um, you know, just demoing weird assorted stuff, also working with clear objects, because I know a lot of the objects that I gave you guys have, you know, either like little lights or like clear stuff, especially the vacuum chamber has like a giant clear gasket thing on it. So I just kind of wanted to touch on a few more things that I think would be helpful for this week. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to really quickly just assign everything Lambert 1 and basically start from scratch on this texture. So the first thing that I wanted to go over with you guys is basically just if you guys are doing glass or like clear stuff, because I know I sort of touched on it like very briefly last week of like this is transmission, but I wanted to go over some of the settings in more depth. So I'm going to go ahead and assign this a new material. Go ahead and make that just like an AI standard surface. And let's get a render going. And this is, let me know if you see lag. It seemed from my tests earlier that my computer wasn't being completely terrible with lag, but, you know, now I'm streaming and doing other things, so who knows. Alright, so, and then the basic light setup that I have for this is basically just like one area light shining down this way, just being there, and then just like a random dome light. So nothing terribly fancy in terms of lighting. Alright, so I'm going to grab this glass, and what I'm going to do is go through and actually label my textures while I go. Pretty much, I just want this to be clear glass, so I'm just going to go ahead and turn the transmission weight all the way up. Now we have milk in a glass. Yay. I am actually really quickly going to hide this center things just so you guys can see what it looks like without that in there. So there's a few different settings that people normally want to look for glass. And I think actually, because I've gone through and I've changed some settings, okay, weird. Normally, if you want something to be glass or like transparent, if you're getting a really hard shadow on it, you're going to have to go into the shape node for that object. And then there should be an Arnold tab here, and you would just want to uncheck opaque. So in this case, I think because I have this very bright area light, it's not making a huge difference. But a lot of times, you know, like I said, if you're getting like a really solid, bizarre shadow, you will need to go in and untick that little checkbox. Alright, so if you're working with, ouch. One thing that drives me crazy about Arnold is if you make something fully transparent, it's or like glass, you just can't see it, and you just gotta like take it on faith it's there, which is annoying. But anywho. So, under transmission, there's a few things that you can play with. Normally, honestly, I will oftentimes just sort of recommend going through and playing with them to see what they do. So color, in this case, is basically going to tint your glass. It's also going to tint, you know, whatever light or shadow is coming through your glass. So that's an option if you know, want that for anything. White is basically no tint, so if you don't want tint, make it white. Um, Depth is one of those things where, like, honestly, I will always, like, I'll slider it around a lot and I can never figure out exactly what it does. Same thing a lot of times for, like, anything you guys would need. You're probably not going to need to go super hard to, like, scatter or, like, scatter anisotropy. Because most of the stuff, especially for this week and for your finals that I think you guys are doing, is most just, like, it's a sheet of glass. So honestly, like, most of these default settings are going to work totally fine. The one kind of fun thing, if you want to play with it, is this dispersion ABE whatever formula thing. This is going to give, you can kind of see it from the renders. A lot of times it'll take longer to render, which kind of sucks. But it goes through and it gives like that little, if you've ever looked in like the bottom of a thick glass, you get these like sort of weird little like rainbowy reflections. That's basically what that's for. So it's kind of fun if you wanted to, and again, if you're making like a thick glass object, it'll show up more than a thin one. You could add that in if you want to. There's also options for stuff like extra roughness if you wanted it. I'm going to turn this down so it doesn't take as long to render. This is basically just like frost the ever-living crap out of your glass. In this case, I don't find a huge difference between the roughness under specular and the roughness under transmission. It will make your renders like super gross noisy a lot of times, which is just kind of one of the risks of using transmission. A lot of times you will need to bump your render settings up a little bit. And then the other thing, so there's like one other setting, but actually before we get to that, let me go over very briefly some render settings for transmission. I will go over these in depth later, but since we have a very good example of hideous looking objects, if you go into your render settings and click on this little Arnold Renderer tab, you will see numerous settings here. This is where you adjust global render settings for your whole scene. So depending on what you're doing, you may or may not, like this is normally the last thing that I'll do, is up the render settings for the whole scene. A lot of times what'll happen is you'll have, you know, one light, and that's causing like one or two like grainy shadows. So each light also does have its own samples within the light itself. Normally it'll start at 1 for a light. I've actually bumped this up already. But in this case, I know that's not really going to do anything, because this issue is just from the transmission or like clear glassy effect that I put on the object. So what I'm going to do in this case is just set, so basically these modify things for specific attributes of shaders across all shaders in your scene when rendering. So in this case, diffuse is going to be basically just like color. Specular is the shiny stuff. If you have, you know, metal stuff, a lot of times it's going to be affected very heavily by specular. Transmission, glass stuff. SSS is subsurface scattering. So in this case, unless you've used a preset or turned that on in one of your shaders, you can just straight up set that to 0. Same thing for volume indirect a lot of times. I think the defaults are pretty much 3 and then 2 down the line. So what we can do is turn up, I'm just going to go really aggressively and turn this up to like 10 and let this render for a sec. But you'll notice that like once I do that, it's going to chug along for a minute because that's a lot of samples. It should come out with a much smoother render. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just isolate a certain area to sort of test render if I'm looking to reduce samples. And then I will, oftentimes, like if I can't figure out by changing a value by like 1 or 2 if it's doing what I want it to do, I'll just go kind of crazy like I've done here and be like, let's set it to 10! And like, you know, if you set it to 10 and it's still not rendering correctly, like it's probably a different setting that you need to tweak. This is incidentally why you don't usually want to set things to 10, because it's taking a long time to render. To the point where I might give up on this render and maybe boost this down to like 6 question mark. Anyway. The goal basically of sampling is to get the cleanest, least noisy render that you can with the fewest amount of samples possible, because randomly boosting these settings up is going to make your renders take a whole lot longer. So there's no, people always ask like, you know, what should I set my samples to? Hey, it's rendering now, yay. And unfortunately, there's no, you know, magic number for samples. I mean, the magic number is basically, if you have all the time in the world, bump all your settings up to the max. But, you know, that's obviously not feasible. So it is really just a matter of, you know, it depends on, you know, the objects that you're doing, your lighting. There's so many things, so it really is like very scene dependent what you need these numbers to be. Um, so there's no, it is just sort of like you fiddle with things until it gets you the quality you need, and at a time that's hopefully not totally like terrible. But you can see that it's still a little bit grainy, but it's definitely better than it was before. And I think a lot of this is actually just sort of that extra roughness setting. It's just sort of going through and frosting the glass. Um, but that's a quick bit on sort of sampling, I guess. A very aggressive way of doing sampling. Now in this case, I'd be like, okay, cool, this is either, good enough or not good enough, in which case I would adjust this accordingly. Again, probably could take this down several fewer samples. I'm gonna go ahead and just set this back to 2 for now, so it actually renders for the demo. I'll probably come back and touch a little bit more on the sampling stuff later, but does anybody have any questions so far? All right, cool. Okay. And like I said, there's like one other setting. I'm gonna turn down this extra roughness because it's crazy. You will also notice again that like the specular roughness will affect the look of this glass. So I don't usually recommend setting this down to 0 because it's just not super realistic. But you can also make frosted glass this way. It's just sort of a different kind of frosted effect. All right. So the other thing that I mentioned is the IOR, or index of refraction. And this is actually one of those weird things where it's pretty obvious effect, like when you slider it. It basically just changes kind of like how thick the glass looks to an extent. It's basically how light distorts when it hits the glass. So if you're going for like ultimate realism, what you can actually do is plug in numbers from the interwebs. I'll go over that in half a second. Or you can just sort of slider through values and be like, okay, I kind of like this. Actually, I kind of do like this. That's kind of cool looking. The one thing to be aware of is that Arnold is a physically based rendering system. So basically all of these numbers are based on real world math. So if we do IOR of glass, I just Googled IOR of math, and you can literally see they will give you specific numbers for these objects. So like, it's literally telling me that like basically for realistic glass, I should use 1.52 for the index of refraction. And if I want water in that glass, I would want basically 1.33 for that index of refraction. So if you're trying to like do specific stuff, there's like whole lists of this, of like literally just like, again, different things. Apparently index of refraction from mercury and like a bunch of other weird stuff is all here if you guys ever want to reference this. It's super easy to find. Otherwise, again, just sort of play with values until you find something you kind of like. The other thing to be aware of is, again, since this is based on real-world math, if your objects are not built to scale, that real-world math goes a little bit out the window, because if you have a 2mm tall glass like I do, it's maybe like 20 millimeters tall. And I'm trying to make this look like a full-size, like thick glass. I'm gonna have to tweak the numbers because no realistic glass is that small. So also be aware of that. Again, if you're trying to use those real-world numbers, it is good to make your stuff to scale, or at least roughly to scale. So that's basically a quick bit on glass. I also mentioned again that if we had this sort of water in here, in this case, all I've done to make this is, I do like how much it looks like milk. It's kind of satisfying. But basically all I did is I've gone through and I've just duplicated this glass, and I just sort of like picked a area to add that milk, and I just deleted the geometry and basically just duplicated like the inside of this. So this is pretty much an exact copy of the inside of this glass. So I'm going to go ahead and assign this a new material, and I think, fun tidbit, Alt-Z is going to undo your last camera move if you ever need to do that. So I think actually there is a fun preset for orange juice somewhere in here, which I've never found to look terribly like orange juice. This also feels like it definitely is probably wanting me to close and reopen my render view, which has been the bane of my existence all morning. Alright. Yeah, so that is probably messed up, I would imagine, because we don't have any kind of, probably because this isn't to scale. I'm actually not super sure why this is looking so weird. But anywho, so again, you can just plug in the default values for that. Pretty much all I did for the water is I just went through and I remember that value was like 1.33. So if we go in, turn on transmission, set IOR to 1.33, we should get something that looks pretty much like a glass of water with water in it. The other thing that can sort of affect your glass renders is the shape of the water. So right now I have it clipping through the glass ever so slightly. If we move this in, you can see it creates like a little bit of a different effect along the edge. If we make this like significantly tinier, you do reach a point where it's going to get like obvious. Like you can kind of see in here where it's like not quite touching the glass. So just be aware of that. You know, if you're, this is a very extreme example, but like you can nest glass objects basically. But yeah, so that's my quick bit on sort of water and glass and stuff. That's also applicable to other things. So not necessarily, just a glass of water. You can also use transmission for things like eyeballs. So I'm actually going to go through, that's a lot of standard surface shaders. I'm going to go through and just assign this a new one and call this, the outside of the eye is called the sclera, which I probably am spelling wrong, but whatever. So I'm going to do the same thing for that. I'm just going to pop through and do, cool. I'm going to turn the transmission weight of that all the way up. And in this case, it's not doing a whole lot of super noticeable anything now, but you will notice that if we sort of maybe look at this from a slight angle, hide this goofy ball here. If we go through and we change the index of refraction of this, it's going to change pretty dramatically like what the eyeball of this inside looks like. So again, eyeballs, I'm sure you could find the number for this online. A lot of times will just sort of do based on whatever aesthetic I like. But you can get some interesting effects, like when you're looking at the eye from the side, right? Like you get that little bit of sort of distortion in there, which is kind of fun. But it just kind of depends if you're looking for like hyperrealism or not. So this was actually a setup similar to what I would probably do if you guys were doing, for your final object, some kind of like screen on a or on a PlayStation Switch. On a Switch or something like that, where I would basically just build a plate of glass and then have a little piece of screen geometry under it. And that little screen geometry under it is, what you would basically apply if you were going to have like the thing turned on. You would apply the texture there, and then have your screen with all the, whatever smudges and stuff that you want in it. Alright, so I think that was pretty much the glass stuff I wanted to go over. So before I pop into some other sort of other shading stuff, does anybody have any questions on any of that? Alright, cool. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to throw this in a display layer so I don't keep selecting it accidentally. To do that, I'm just going to your channel box and hit this little button down here, create new layer with the objects you have selected. And that way I can set that to be a reference object, so it's still there. Like if we look in our scene, you can still see it there. I'm not gonna be able to click it, which is nice because I'm trying to get the stuff inside that shape. Except now I seem to have done something weird, and there we go. Okay, weird. All right, so I do want to go over one or two just like weird UVing tidbits. I don't know if they're gonna be relevant to anyone. It's just kind of like things I found helpful over the years. So one of those things is every once in a while, if you're looking for something like an eyeball, and you have, hang on, this I can actually just show you in the viewport. So if you were looking for something like an eyeball, and you want like a pinkish tinge in the back of that, what you can do is just map a ramp texture in here, and this is not gonna be a realistic eye with like, veins and stuff like that in it, but cats are screaming in the background. But what you can do is basically make the back of this red. We come in here to our shaded view. You should see that this is doing a pretty nice thing actually, where it's doing again red in the back, going into white in the front. White. If you look in the pupil area, it's white. So what we can do from here is go in. What is why? Okay. Turn off the sclera for now. It's being annoying. Alright, so what we can do from there is refine that a little bit, right? So if we want, maybe this eye isn't so horrendously bloodshot as I had it. And you can refine that as needed, and also go in and add, some kind of black for the pupil if you wanted to color the pupil in there. And just make that a nice little hard line, and then you have, again, really quick and easy texture for the eyeball. It's not perfect, but the thing that makes that work is basically, for some reason ramp textures don't show up super great in the UV editor. But the thing that makes this work is the default UVs for a circle. So if you've changed these, you're not going to be able to do this super reliably with a ramp shader, but because they give you these ridiculously linear, perfectly straight lines, it makes it very, very easy to do this kind of texturing on it. The same thing can actually be said, for the most part, for a torus. I guess it doesn't really matter. Alright. So you can do the same thing again if we just make a surface shader for this. If we look at these torus UVs... Oh, wait, sorry, this is actually... I have two versions of this iris for two different bits. Alright, so if we look at the UVs for this, again, for some reason, toruses give you these really nice, like, perfect UVs, which lend themselves really nicely to being textured with a ramp shader. So if we pop up our... I actually have this one already textured, but you can see I've done the same thing where I just make a ramp texture and I just added some kind of eyeball texture in here, and it allows us to get this really, really nice sort of gradient with our textures. So just, again, a weird quick tidbit. I don't know if that's going to be useful for anything you guys are doing, but I know a few people, particularly in my Anip 2 class, they're all doing robots right now. I found this kind of helpful. So that's pretty much that. The other thing that you can do is, if you found, like, the perfect internet texture for your stuff, in this case, oh look, I found a really nice eyeball texture. What you can do is go in and UV your object for that iris texture. So in this case, I have this little eyeball, this iris thing here. And this is, like, again, one of those things where I think it makes more sense to do this, like, after you've done a little bit of texturing, so you're, like, sort of familiar with how it works and when you might want to do this. But I'm going to go ahead and pop in the file texture for that eyeball. Yay. And because I've already set up my UVs for this, it lines up nicely. But basically we have, a pretty direct translation of that iris texture onto this object. So all I really did to get these nicer looking UVs is, if we look at this, I did a planar map on this. So basically just planar mapped it from the front. I came around and I decided that the inside, like, pretty much cutting this in half this way would be an easy way to cut this. Go ahead and actually cut it. And you could do a few things at this point. So you could either go ahead and just scale these down so that basically your UVs are just covering the actual eye texture itself. Or you could unfold them and then do that. And in this case, I think the unfolding is going to yield a better result. It might be a little bit hard to see here, but there's like a little bit of texture stretching because it's a planar map. So what I'm going to do is just grab these UV shells and do a modify unfold. And in this case, they're actually still pretty much scaled where they were before. And we still have... My monitor is like... There we go. We still have a little bit of a seam, but it's much better than it was previously. And that's basically how I did that. So you will notice that all the times I harped on you guys for not having overlapping UVs, I have overlapping UVs here. And the reason that I did that is basically just, if you catch this at the right angle, you might maybe see the seam over here. And just by leaving these UVs kind of on top of each other, it was an easy way to ensure that that seam would be less obvious than if I were to do something like... let me try to get the back of this thing. If I didn't have overlapping UVs, what I would probably do is just stash this one over here. But then if you see this from the side, which maybe you would in the render, you get that really gross seam there. So this is like one of the few instances where, in my opinion, it makes sense to have overlapping UVs and kind of like break the rules a little bit, because it gives you just sort of like a nicer effect, and you're using still the vast majority of the area of your rendered image. But that being said, none of you guys are making eyeballs. It was just like a weird sort of aside where, like, again, if you do find like a really perfect texture like this, it's, you know, you can design your UVs around it. You don't necessarily need to like rip the whole texture apart to like put it into some Photoshop UV kind of deal. Yeah, so I think, is it okay to have overlapping UVs of duplicated objects? And I think it depends largely on what the object is. If it's something like a little screw that you're going to duplicate a few times, a lot of times what I'll do is make like 3 versions of that screw with UVs in different places. So basically I have, it's the same model, but I'm able to texture it differently so that if I'm duplicating this thing over and over, it gives a little bit more variation to it. But yeah, so it just depends on what you're doing. If it's like a main, something like an eyeball, I will shamelessly duplicate UVs for that. But if you need those objects to have separate textures, so for example, like the stuff that you worked on for the first model with like the pliers and all that stuff, that would be something where like the handle of the pliers, I wouldn't necessarily duplicate that texture because it's 2 main parts of the object with, you know, separate texturing. Like when I was looking at the pliers, I found like scratches on one side that like weren't on the other, that kind of thing. So it definitely, I think it would depend largely on what you're doing. Where main objects, I would probably tweak the UVs if I needed to, so that I could like texture it independently. But if you're just duplicating, like I said, screws are a great example for like little side objects. Shamelessly leave them overlapping. In my opinion, that's kind of fine. You can always pull them out later if you really need to for texturing. But yeah. So that was long-winded, but did that sort of answer your question? Sweet. All right. Cool. So anything else before we wander forth into the next little bit? Cool. Okay, so the next thing that I did want to go over with you guys is a bit about save this creepy eyeless face for my next demo. Actually, I can do something really weird and just duplicate this eyeball and put it in this face. Ha ha ha, that's not unsettling at all. Beautiful. Okay, sorry. Anyway. So what I want to show you guys how to do, and this is entirely optional if you guys want to do this, I just thought it was like an interesting sort of segue into the, you can do a lot of texturing within Maya without needing to make custom Photoshop files. So this is one of the bits where if you guys are going to do that this week, I have no problem with that. Just make a note of what you did, so that if I do go into your textures and I see like one internet file, I know that there's other things I should be looking at. So I will do this a lot for backdrops. I think it's really fun to make like weird, you know, metal embroidery kind of shapes. So what I'm gonna do is I have this delightful, let's get a render going here. Have you guys been having any lag with the rendering so far? Hopefully not. Okay. Either way, super unsettling eyeball. Anyway, so we have a render. Yo, I am so stoked about not having... I'm using the integrated graphics card on my computer right now. I literally do not have a separate one installed. And it's better than my old one. Anyway. Also, everything's like RGB now, and it's weird. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is... I have this super glorious texture. So if you're gonna do this, I recommend finding a tiling texture. I think I for some reason, I couldn't find a lot of the ones that I like today, but if you just Google like black and white texture or like black and white scroll texture, it'll pull up a bunch of like this stuff, or like, you know, in this case I'm going to use the houndstooth texture because it was the only tiling one I could find. You can take this one black and white image and make like a whole custom texture off of it just in Maya. So what I'm going to do is, the first thing, I'll map it into metalness because I think that's like a it's gonna be pretty obvious once I put that in. Oh lord. Great. It's gonna be pretty obvious once I put that in what it does. In this case, it does seem like I need to go in under color balance again and tick the alpha as luminance button. And then we have this really, really weird looking metal houndstooth texture. In this case, so if we're looking at like the overall scene here, let's let's push the render. Let's see if I can do the whole thing at once. If it starts lagging, let me know. But in this case, I'm thinking this should be like a smaller texture because it looks kind of crazy. I know I've done this before, but like if you look in the Place 2D File node, so if you're in like where you would map in the texture, there should be this little node pretty much always here. Maya makes it automatically. If you click on that, this basically allows you to repeat the U and V texture repeatedly. Then this is actually really, really handy for doing certain stuff where maybe, like if you found a nice little tiling image that's like 200 pixels big, if you put that and stretch that over this entire thing, it would look terrible. However, if you repeated that texture numerous times, in this case 10, okay, maybe 10 is like a little bit small, I'm gonna go 5. If you repeat that texture, it's going to basically stretch and use that 200 pixel image over less of your screen. So you can basically have smaller image files and render it faster. In this case, I'm basically just using it because I wanted the texture to be a little bit smaller. So you can just repeat that. You can also stretch it really crazy if you want to. Like if I did, 10 here, it'll distort the texture and make it like longer than it is wide. It's a more aggressive example. So you can see it stretching a little bit that way. So that's my first little bit, is that sort of Place 2D texture node. I love it. It's delightful. So the other thing that you can do while you're rendering this is go in and add a bump map. So that's a thing where a lot of times, again, if I'm doing cloth texture for this, I'm totally just going to pop in to my geometry tab and just add a little default Maya cloth texture, which by default is going to be like 5 giant pieces of fabric, which makes no sense. So this is most definitely one of those instances I would pop in to that little Place 2D texture node. And usually for cloth, I'll set this up to something really high. This is a smallish plane, so I'm going to try maybe like 150. And you can see that now, again, we have nice little, still probably too large, but we have, we have nice little sort of cloth textures, and that we didn't even need to pull a file in. So that's really nice. It probably would also make sense to maybe go back in and like set the bump depth down a little bit, if I can find the bump depth. So I'll try maybe like 0.2 or something, just to make that less aggressive. It depends really what you're looking for. So already we have a kind of customized texture. I haven't even put anything into the color channel yet. So what I'm going to do, before I go forward, is there any questions on anything I've done so far? Alrighty then. Cool. So next bit is going to be basically a brief introduction to the hypershade, which is the best thing ever. So hypershade, if you go into Windows rendering editors hypershade, you can pull it up here. There's also a little button for it right here, so I pretty much never use the menu settings for it. But this is your hypershade. Normally, there's I guess a few different pieces. So it'll give you a sample render basically of whatever object or whatever texture you're working on. It's going to show you up here all of the different textures you currently have in your scene. And it's going to show you, if you've, in this case, all the different texture files I have in here, like I have all these weird iris textures and stuff. Basically just like a little tab, it'll show you your lights, any cameras you have, but it's just everything. It shows you there's a lot of stuff in here. Probably for this class, all you're going to need is the materials and the textures tab. So this stuff over here, if you want to make extra textures, you can do that here. This is basically that same little thing, same little window that pulls up if you like right-click and do assign new texture. Same thing here. You could actually get rid of that if you want it. Like, I'm actually not going to use that, so I'm just going to close that out. And then it also gives you, this is basically a duplicate over here of your attribute editor for, again, whatever thing specifically in the hypershade that you're working on. Alright, so this is the area down here that gets super, super fun and also really, really messy the more into this you go. So basically, this allows you a sort of visual display of all of the different connections going to all of your textures. And you can update stuff in here, and it's really cool. So what I'm going to do is hit this little button here. This is basically just going to get rid of all of this extra crapola in here. That was stuff that I was working on previously. I'm just screaming again in the background. Alright, so I'm going to go through, first of all, I'm going to figure out what I actually name this texture. For real. Okay. Good naming conventions. Okay, so if we find this cloth for real texture, haha, cool. We can add this into this graph here because I want to basically work on it down there. So I'm going to hit this little button here, add selected nodes to graph. It's going to pop that in down there. And then navigation here is pretty much just scroll wheel, and you can just sort of click and drag stuff around. If you need to pan back and forth, you can use the middle mouse button. And then it also sort of, you know, depending on the scroll will target where your mouse is or where your cursor is, so you can kind of get around that way too. All right, so what we're going to do in here, this is basically just a little list of all of the attributes for this object. If you wanted to, there's a little hamburger menu here. You can expand this or contract it as wanted. But what I'm going to do is I want to see the incoming and outgoing connections from this. So if I hit this little button here, it's like a square with like 2 arrows in it. That's going to show you, again, all of the incoming connections to the left and the outgoing connections to the right. So you can see here, like in metalness, we have the little scroll image that we did. So if we click on that, we see all of the different attributes, you know, from here. This is, again, exactly the same thing that you would find in the attribute editor here if I was like looking at that correct file thing. You also, if you need it, easy access to the Place 2D texture node. This is, again, a default thing Maya makes. You can't really get rid of it. It's just sort of there. And then we also have that little bump map here that we added. So what we can do now is I want to add color to this, and I want to add some roughness to this. But the downside of going in, okay, good, that's paused. The downside of going in and doing something like, cool, roughness, you map in your file texture, then you have to like go in and you map the scroll thing again. I'm actually just, it's not going to show up really if I do it. The downside of doing that is that, one, you have to map the same file texture a bunch of times, and two, if you've done something like change the repeat U and V of this, you have to do that for every single file that you import. It's also going to be more labor intensive for the computer because instead of just grabbing one file and reusing it, it has to grab like the same file over and over and over. And if you want to change that repeat UV to something like 6 instead of 5, you have to do it every single place you use that texture map. It's really redundant, it's really annoying. I've done it before, it sucks. It is a viable way to do things, it's just not the most efficient. Alright, so what I'm going to do is you can see actually that like as soon as I added that little specular map, it's gone through and it's popped in some more little nodes here. I'm going to delete those. And selecting things is pretty much just click on it. If you want, you can click and drag to move it around, or you can just delete it. Hitting delete or backspace will literally delete it. Same thing as it would like delete an object in a scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab, you can basically also create connections in here instead of just viewing them. If you grab this little like circly thing next to the scroll texture, you can drag that on to a bunch of different attributes here. And the nice thing about this is it's graying out the ones that you can attach it to. And in this case, I am trying to attach this to roughness, specular roughness. Haha, specular roughness, here we go. So you'll notice as I try to drag that on, it's like, you can't do that. If you ever get that, basically what this is it's saying out color is always RGB values, and specular roughness only wants a single value. So what you can do, super easy fix, just grab either the R, the G, or the B. For a black and white image, it doesn't really make a difference. I usually just do R. So grab the little R value, and then you map that into specular roughness. There we go. Hello. Cool. So the nice thing about this is that anytime I update this texture here, so if I were to change the UV, the repeat UV, it would update for every single thing that I have this mapped into, and you can plug this into as many things as I want. Like, I could plug out color R into specular and metal, like I could plug this into everything if I wanted to, and I wanted to be crazy. I don't want to do that, so I'm not going to, but you could. You can also, if you need to break a connection, just grab this little arrow thing and just drag it off into the void and let it go, and then it'll go away. Does that make sense? You guys with me so far? Alright, cool. Let me just make sure that this isn't... Something's a little weird with my fans, and they're always kind of running at high speed, so I can't tell if my computer is, like, chugging, like, for real, or if it's just being stupid. Anywho. Okay, so what we can do is let's take a look actually at this render and see what we have from this. In this case, it seems that the values that I've put in, you can see that the texture is still sort of showing up. We have these little darker areas here with a little bit more metal, but maybe this isn't quite what we want. So there's some extra stuff that you can do in your hypershade to get a little bit more control over these values. And basically all you want to do for that is, there's a few things you can do. For this, I'm just going to map everything through a ramp. So I need to create basically a ramp texture in here. So if you want to create any new nodes, all you need to do is hit tab, and then anywhere your cursor is going to pull up this little search box, and you can just search for whatever you want. So if I search ramp, it's going to bring up a bunch of, like, anything. It basically will run a search for anything with ramp in it. In this case, I want a ramp texture. So I'm going to go ahead, mouse down to that, and just hit enter. It has now made a lovely new ramp texture. This is not connected to anything, it's just sort of there. So in order for us to actually do something useful with this, what I need to do is grab the out color R, and instead of putting that in specular roughness, I'm going to drag it up to, I'm going to expand this, I'm going to drag this up to my V chord. So you can do a U chord, you can do V chord, it doesn't really matter. The only reason that I do V chord is because by default, and this is just UV coordinate, by the way, is the abbreviation for that. By default, this is set to a V ramp. If you set this to U ramp, then the value you'd want is the U chord. But again, the only thing that it is like 2 extra button clicks, so I don't like doing that, so that's why the only reason I map this into V chord. But if you put it in U and notice it's not working, change the ramp type. Alright, so we have this plugged into the ramp texture, and then what this should allow us to do is, let's say we wanted to basically, this works more or less like sort of like the levels in Photoshop, where basically anything that was black over here, it's going to make this new color here, and then anything over here is going to make, oh god, that vibrates. It's going to make this new color, anything that was white is going to now be the color over here. So for grayscale images, you'd have some more interesting stuff going on in the middle of this, but in this case, since it was black and white, it pretty much just says, hey, anything that was black is now this horrible teal color, and anything that was not black is now this god-awful pink color. So that's just like a really handy thing within Maya to very easily change the color of images. I use this more often than is probably reasonable. And then to actually use that in our, actually, let's put this into our base color. So I'm going to grab out color and just plug that into base color. Since this has RGB values, and out color also has RGB values, you can just grab the whole out color and put it straight in. That's basically the equivalent of taking the R, the G, and the B and dragging them all individually into there. But lesser connections and just kind of easier to look at. So if we do that, we get this really atrocious looking color thing here, which is really, really ugly. But that's how you can remap textures, and you can do that as many times as you want. So what I'm actually going to do really quick is I'm going to break this connection because it'll be easier to demo this without color in this. So I'm going to do the same thing I did before, hit tab, go down and do a ramp texture, and then just pop in the R value into the B chord, and this time I'm actually going to, like a real person, do the specular roughness. So I'm going to grab the R value from this and drag that into specular roughness. And for stuff with incoming, so you can take a value and put it into other objects as many times as you want, but each attribute can only have a single incoming connection. So like specular roughness can only get a value from one thing. So by overriding this with the out color R from the ramp instead of the texture, now that is looking at the ramp instead. So again, by default, this isn't terribly, interesting. Ooh, that color is very blue. Boop. Now it's white. Yay. Alright, so off the bat, like I said, not terribly interesting. But if we start changing these values on this slider thing, you can get a little bit more interesting values here. And just remember, so if you're having a hard time sort of picturing like what these sliders do, or like if should you make it white or should you make it black, the left side of your ramp is always going to map into the black, darker textures from your original image. So like anywhere, like I said, in this that was black is going to be the value from this left area. Anything white is going to be over here. Same thing again with like Photoshop levels, basically works the same way. And then in terms of if you're looking for a white or black value for the actual slider values themselves, so I am mapping this into specular roughness. So if I go back and I look at the roughness value here, my specular roughness, let me demo this really quick. So I'll break this connection. So basically, no roughness. And you can also visualize this before plugging your textures in if that helps, just like slider this around and like see what it does. Basically, no roughness is going to make really, really shiny areas, so no roughness is going to be black, a value of black. If you have extreme roughness, it's going to do whatever this is doing and then have a value of white. So in this case, probably some combination of like gray is going to work for what I want to do. I'm going to go ahead and plug that back into specular roughness, and then just grab this little ramp dude, and you can also just sort of slider things until you get a value that you think doesn't look terrible, honestly, is a lot of times what I'll do for this. So maybe something like that. Again, we're just getting like a little bit of shiny in here. It's not like super crazy. It's not making everything like overly dark. But, you know, you can play with those values as much as you need, basically. But that's the basic premise of how to do things. Yes. Or wait, was that me saying and it being reflected back at me? That's gross. Okay. Cool. So any questions on that so far? So I'm gonna really quick just pop in the RGB awfulness that I made for this back into the color. And you can see in this preview it's doing a little bit better job of showing off the shininess in that metal area. But what I'm gonna do, quick, what color do we want this tablecloth? Anyone have preferences? Okay. Say again? Hello.
Green.
I like green. Green is good. All right, cool. So we have some kind of green with, I don't know. I feel like gold always looks good with green, so I'm just gonna kind of like try to make the little metal areas like orangey. So now I have like this weird green tablecloth with these, you know, shiny gold areas in it. And the nice thing about this is like, again, it doesn't show up super well necessarily like on a flat surface, but you can kind of see like if you scroll farther out, you do get a little bit of that sort of shiny effect in it. So just sort of, this is one of those things where if you did want to use an internet texture, like I did no outside modifications to that texture, I just did a bunch of weird stuff in Maya. And you can see at some point this will start taking a while to render. But that's one of those things where, again, just make sure that you make a note if that's what you did. But I am totally cool if you guys want to do stuff like this, especially for like tablecloths or like other weird stuff. The only downside to this, and I would like to, yeah, I was also kind of feeling the weird leprechaun vibes, but the only thing I would like to stress about this is if you want to easily port your stuff to a different program, like you made this in Maya, you're like, cool, maybe I want to throw this in a game engine or like upload it online. You need to, I believe you can still export these maps, but you need to jump through a lot of hoops to do it. Compared to making a file in Photoshop. And also, like, this file, honestly, would be really easy to make in Photoshop. It's just sometimes I'm lazy and it's kind of more fun in Maya. You get more immediate feedback on, like, what you're doing. So that's just a matter of sort of preference on what you guys like to do. I did the same thing for the walls, but I'm not going to do that in this one because effort. So that was, I'm going to go over one or two other things in the Hypershade. But before we go on, does anybody have any questions on anything I did for this? It's sort of the basis of all the other things. All right. Oof. Moving right along then. Alright, so the other thing that I wanted to go over with you guys is displacement maps. And displacement maps are super gosh darn fun. Alright. That was weirdly sarcastic. So I'm going to set up two textures. Actually, I'm going to set up a bump map, and then I'm going to set up a displacement map so you guys can see the difference. So I downloaded from the interwebs. Okay, scrolling is being weird. So I basically downloaded a displacement map from textures.com just to like show you guys what this does. I do find that oftentimes displacement maps from the default Maya textures will be like a little bit eccentric sometimes. So I'm going to go ahead and just throw a bump map into this with the same file texture I'm going to use for the displacement demo. Leave all this stuff as default for the bump map. Yay. And alright, this is the thing I want. Alright, so that looks like really weird scars. Also, if anyone's curious, I did UV this head. This is the UVs for the head. Anywho. So, I don't need that. Alright, so this is a bump map. If we render this, if we render it on you, haha, beautiful. If we render this, you can see there's no actual effect to like the outside of the body. It just sort of, you know, makes a weird texture on the surface. And that's fine, depends on what you want. In this case, you know, if you want the surface to deform, you can use a displacement map for that. So a lot of these textures, or a lot of these files, like, will have available displacement maps online. If you want to use online displacement textures, like, that's cool. I don't really care. You can also make your own. That's kind of like a whole different bit I'm not really going to get into this quarter. But, yeah. So I just want to show you, again, the difference between bump and displacement. Displacement is a little bit more annoying to hook up. It's not terrible, but there's, like, a few more hoops you need to jump through. So if you do want to set up a displacement texture, what you need to do is make a new material like normal, and you actually need to hook it up. I think it's easiest to just do it from the hypershade, so grab, oh god, AI standard surface 21, or name it like a real person. Alright, so I'm just going to clean everything out down here, and then map this out down here. So we have, again, any incoming connections, which this is a new shader, there are none, and then any outgoing connections. And actually, this little outgoing connection here is where you're going to map your displacement shadow, your displacement stuff into. So you'll see if you click on this little dude, you have the option for your displacement map, and this is where you're going to map in your file texture here. So you can get to that, you know, if you're in your attribute editor. If you go up to here, you kind of think it's this button. And it'll take you back to that map, but it also, for some reason, to me, it's just a lot easier to do that in the hypershade. I get lost a lot of times looking at this stuff. But anywho, so you just map your stuff in like you normally would. Go in and actually find, like I said, the same file as before. Where actually, no, I'm gonna do a better demo. So remember how I said you can access all of your textures here? That includes like the texture that we just added in. And you can also go through and name these more logical things if you want to be able to actually see what you're doing. But what you can do is you can grab any file from here and just like middle mouse button drag that into the incoming connection for your image, and it should map that file texture in there. In this case, I'm just going to re-upload the file because I have no idea what I named it, because I'm not doing nice naming conventions for this. So if you guys are downloading stuff like this from textures.com, height is the map that you want to use for displacement. Just FYI, it should end at like _height. And that should theoretically be most of the stuff you need to do to set up a displacement map. So let's give this a quick render. It's going to look really bad, but you can see that we do have actual deformation happening on the surface of this object, which is what we want. So that's the difference, again, between bump. Bump in normal map will basically make fake texture on the surface of your object, whereas a displacement map will actually deform or displace the surface and like affect the profile of your piece. So before I go forward, God, looks like I just like punch them in the face. Does anybody have any questions on the difference between a bump and a displacement map? All right. Lone floating eyeball. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is there's a few. This one actually didn't map totally terribly, which is like actually kind of surprising to me. I am going to grab this area light and just make it a little bit less insanely overexposed. So hopefully maybe you guys can actually see what's going on a little bit better. All right. So there's a few things that you normally would need to do to make this texture show up a little bit better. And one of those things is going into the shape node for that object, going down again to this Arnold tab, same place you would check if it's opaque or not opaque. And if you scroll down, there should be a few checkboxes that you're interested in. So one is subdivision. By default, this is set to none. And you can see, like, if you're looking at, just render the top of the head. So if we're looking at, like, the top of this head, this is, again, the default setting for this is set to none. If you ever import a displacement map, and this is going to be more obvious if you're making your own and you know what they should look like, but if you're finding it's not giving you the resolution you want, set this to Cat Clark, and then normally you'd want to, like, up the iterations of that smoothing. What this basically does, the whole idea of a displacement map is it gives you extra fake geometry to work with. So it's basically projecting in additional resolution to get these details. So if, basically by adding more subdivision or like a different, anything but none here, it's going to give you more fake geometry to work with. So that's the kind of thing where, again, if you're looking at your stuff isn't quite getting the resolution you expect, you can come in and basically add manually more fake subdivisions for your object. And that usually will fix the issue. So the other thing that you might want to do in the Arnold tab while you're in the shape node is pop down to the displacement attributes. You can, if you want, adjust the height of the bump map here. If you're doing something, making a custom map, I recommend just making it correctly, kind of thing. You can also do something really extreme and like make the bump map more aggressive, in which case you'll see that there's some errors happening up here. Really creepy. And obviously just to demo in the viewport, there's no change to the actual geometry here. It's still a very low-res object, and we have these crazy spikies. But in this case, like, once we boosted that, if you never notice you're putting a displacement map in, you're getting these weird flat edges here. Under the displacement attributes, again, in your Arnold tab of your shape node, try setting bounds padding to be a little bit higher. Basically what that is, bounds padding is just, how far away from the object do you want to stop rendering this displacement, basically. Oh, good lord. So, again, normally you don't need to set this up to some crazy high value. It's really only there if you are having those weird issues with clipping. So again, like by default this was 0, and then we would get this weird, you can see like the top of the head is being truncated. Like that's when you would want to go in and set that value to be something a little bit higher. And honestly, I feel like normally doing a value of 1 will solve most of your issues. I've had to set that up higher like twice. So that's most of the stuff with exporting a displacement map. The other thing you might need to look at if your map is I'm gonna set this back actually, maybe do something like 2. A little bit less extreme. So the other thing that you might need to look at is also the if you're looking in the displacement file node, like where you imported that file for the first time, sometimes depending on where you import or export where you import your textures from, you'll need to change the color space, as well as sometimes filter. So if you're having issues with a particular texture, normally you can Google like textures.com displacement map settings or something like that for Arnold, and it'll pull up specifically like, ah yes, for this map, like you need to put the filter type to this and the color space to this, etc., etc. So it just depends where you get your textures from. In this case, a lot of times what I find I have to do is set color space to raw. And you can see that's actually punched in a huge amount more detail into this map in here. So that's just like one of those weird quirky things with displacement maps that you oftentimes need to do. So I usually displacement maps are usually raw. If I'm thinking about it, I'll usually do it when I first import the map. But that's basically a very brief intro to displacement maps, and again, probably all you would need to really do with them this week. Does anybody have any questions about that before we pop on to other stuff? Yes, so is there a time when it's better to use bump normal maps? So bump and normal maps are good if you're looking at things from far away. So like, an example would be actually the cloth thing that we did. Unless you really, really need to like zoom up to that cloth texture super crazy close and like see the individual threads coming out of it, use a bump map on it. Any small textures and things, you should be good to do a bump map. Displacement maps you'd really only want if you were looking for, again, changes to like the profile of your model. So where bump maps are or displacement maps are really nice is, if you have to get really close to like a really rough wood grain or something like that, you can model in like a vague lumpy texture to that wood, and then you can make a displacement map for it and get the really fine, nice grain of that wood. But again, that's something where if you were looking really close up at that wood, you might want a displacement map. Something far away, just like a cutting board on a counter, like bump or normal map is going to be better for that. So displacement really is if you do need to like deform the outer piece or like deform the overall shape of your geometry. Kind of like I did here again. Mostly if you're looking for a profile change. So if you're putting a displacement map on something and you're not getting, you're not really seeing the change in the surface of the object, it might be a little bit overkill. I do find that they oftentimes will make nicer, more sort of realistic looking shadows just because it is adding fake geometry, so it does a better job of getting more realistic shadows. But like, again, if you're really not looking for the shifting of the edge of that mesh, normal and bump map are usually fine. I feel like honestly the only time in this class that you might want to do a displacement map is going to be, it might be kind of nicer if you made a custom one for like buttons on a game controller or something like that. Like if you're going to zoom in on those buttons, like get a nice little displacement map in there. But if you're never zooming in on those buttons, bump map all the way. I also just wanted to go over them just so you guys knew that they were there in case you did decide that you needed them for something. They were kind of fun to play with. But yeah. Does that answer your question? Cool. All right. Anything else before we pop on to? I think it was like pretty much like the last texturing thing I wanted to go over, and then I wanted to go over like 2 goofy lighting things.
I'm kind of late, but I wanted to ask a quick question about the nerves. So
Sure.
I forgot about the question. How do you? So let's say you deleted the history. How do you patch a hole? Like obviously at the end of it, if you can't get to the edges of it.
Well, so normally, like for the end of this, it's gonna bother me if this is backwards. So normally to patch a hole at the end of a NURBS curve, I would just go through and just grab that little edge loop and just sort of extrude it and then scale it in, and then you have like a nice capped off curve. I know, I think there's settings in that, I guess, like when you extrude to close the end caps, but like normally I'll just it's just sort of like what I come through and do at the end anyway, so it's just kind of like, once I convert it to polys, I'll just, again, kind of merge everything. That's another reason, actually. So, honestly, most of the reason, practically speaking, when I'm modeling for like non-demo things, it's always for 3D printing, and for that I need polygons, so that's why I convert to polygons in the end. But also converting to polygons just gives you a little bit more flexibility with, if you do want to go through and like tweak stuff, you can extrude faces out of it. You can work it like normal geometry, which is just kind of why I like it and why I usually recommend not using NURBS curves for a final thing, or for your final object. But strictly speaking, just for rendering, I feel like most of the time you can get away with NURBS, and that's fine. Just a weird aside there. But I guess, did that answer your questions about capping stuff off?
So that still works if you delete the history and it doesn't let you use the edging?
Yes, I mean that's basically what I just did there is just basic poly modeling. So that really has no effect on the deleting history of the curve at all. I did actually I deleted the original curve from this, so this is a curve with deleted history. If I remember correctly though, I think you can do this and still have the curve drag the geometry around. It's just usually at that point I'm done with the model anyway. But yeah, you can totally, even with the curve attached, like with or without a curve attached, if this is polygon geometry, you can treat it in just like another object you'd be modeling on. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Alright, any other questions?
I've had an issue where when I'm like drawing the textures and stuff, but if I like make like an edit to it in Photoshop and try to export it and like save it over like the file and project, just have it automatically update, it'll say like, oh, you like don't have access to this file, so I'll need to like save it as like a copy of it and
Yeah.
send the file to that and then like delete the old one. Is there like a way to work around that somehow so it's not as much of a hassle?
Yeah. There might be some kind of setting on your computer that will allow you to just like overwrite files if programs are using them. The best way that I found to do that, and it's not, I'm not gonna sit here and like tell you it's not a colossal pain to do. But the easiest thing I found is find something with a file texture on it. My God. Okay. Um, just pop in here. So I would save. I would do like iTexture. If I needed to make a copy of this, I would just call this like iTexture2, iTexture3, and I would just save it incrementally. And then what you can do is go through. If you just like type in that 3 and hit enter, it's gonna immediately map to that new file. So it's not, like I said, it's still a colossal pain in the ass. And I've not found a good workaround, but that's the fastest workaround I've found, is save versions of your file and then just like change the number at the end of it. It at least saves you having to like click on this and like delete files. Plus then you can go back and grab stuff, which is kind of nice if you don't like a change you made, but yeah. Um, yeah, it's kind of a bummer. Are there any other questions? All right. Okay. So the last thing that I wanted to show you guys today is this, which is basically that for now. Oh crap. Let me really quick. Concrete, and this is moss. Moss. Okay. So I have these two really crappy textures here, and this is what I'm about to show you is practically in the real world, not for this class. I don't care what you do or how you do things, but for this class, what I'm about to show you is the only time I ever want to see straight internet file textures mapped onto your object. So like, something like, again, if you were to just grab this concrete and mix it with this weird moss texture I found, I'll show you guys how to do that in a way where you can get nice targeted textures without making 8,000 Photoshop maps. That is different and different from just making, throwing a texture on stuff direct from the interwebs. So let me really quick show you what these, good lord, what these little sphere dudes look like. If I can get a render going. Render, darn you. Okay. So the moss texture, both of these are just things that I've found randomly from cgtextures.com or textures.com. And they're all quite insane. So I pretty much downloaded, like I said, all the file textures from these. You can see them just floating around here. Again, we have like the albedo, the AO passes, all of these. I've just put all of those in. This is what they look like as straight textures. You can also see the moss has a frankly ridiculous amount of displacement on it. Yeah. So anyway, the moss is just doing its own thing, because that is the same exact sphere as this thing. But anywho. Alright. So I have this other little ball here, and you'll see that if I re-render this with the appropriate texture on it, what have I called that? Too much stuff? This is why, once you get farther into texturing, this is why it's important to label your stuff. Alright. So we have basically this thing, which is a sphere with some weird combination of the moss and the cobblestone on it. So I'm actually, I'm going to show you how to do this just like in Maya. The same principle applies if you were to make a custom map. Unfortunately, I got Photoshop CS6, but that was like 8 years ago, and it's a Mac license, and I still need to heckle Adobe to get onto my dad's account and transfer the Mac license to PC because I don't use Macs anymore, so that I can download. Long story short, I don't have Photoshop on this computer, but you can take file texture just like you normally would. So basically, this is going to be what I would deem pseudo procedural texturing. So I'm going to go ahead and assign this a new material, and instead of grabbing an AI standard surface shader, what I'm going to do is look for the AI mix shader, and I'm going to put that on. By default, it's not really going to do anything terribly interesting. It's just sort of going to be this awful black thing. Alright, but what this allows you to do is basically take two shaders and put them in here, and you can blend between them based on a grayscale, basically. So in this case, I have the concrete shader and the ridiculous moss shader here. So if I pop into my absolute mess of a hypershade, and again, label your stuff, what I can do is grab whatever I called. Actually, here, I can do this. Here's a fun thing. If you have extra textures in here that you know you're not using, edit, delete unused nodes. Anything that's not assigned to an object is going to get deleted. And actually, the reason I didn't do this before is because I had textures that I wanted in here. So do be aware that if something is not assigned to an object, even like a hidden object somewhere, it will be deleted shamelessly. And you can also do the same thing for your texture files. So you can do, if you do edit delete nodes here, that'll also clean your texture files. Alright, so blah. Did I not? Oh, it still labels AI mix too. Weird. I've relabeled the wrong thing. Alright, so if we grab this mix shader here, I'm going to go ahead and just map the incoming connections down here. What you can do is grab middle mouse button, grab each shader. So I'm going to grab the moss and the concrete, and I'm just going to drag them in here. And if we look at this, now it's some weird combination of, it's sort of a greener version of this. And if we mess with the mix weight, you can see that it's basically toggling between the moss shader here and the concrete shader. So this is like really, really handy. I mean, not so much immediately on its own, just with the slider, but we can map stuff into the slider, and that's where it gets fun. The only downside to this is I have not found a way to map the displacements into here. So there's a few extra hoops that you can jump through to like get that done, or you can just combine the groups in Photoshop and kind of call it a day. You can combine the displacement map textures and call it a day. But in this case, like I said, I don't think you guys are going to be using a lot of displacement, so I'm not really going to go over that because it's kind of a pain. But it will get all of the other file info over. So all the normal maps and anything like that will carry over. Alright, so what we want to do is, like I said, I'm just going to start, and I'm going to map a checker texture in here, because it's going to be a really obvious version of, like, what is happening here. Where we have, you can see basically, again, moss in the area that is, I don't know which color is which, white or black. Moss seems to be black in this instance. And then we have concrete anywhere that this is white. So, obviously checker texture, probably not really what you're going for here. But what you can do is use something, if you're doing in Maya textures, and not, going external with like Photoshop or something like that, there's a few different things that you can do to make this look not totally horrible, which, like I said, mostly I'm showing you that because I do not have Photoshop currently on my computer. So for this assignment, if you were going to do something like this, particularly for adding like rust, it's really good for adding rust on the handles of wire cutters, that kind of thing, because you can just make a generic rust texture and make a generic metal texture, and then just paint basically a black and white grayscale map of wherever you want that rust, and it'll just, plug this in, and it'll just show up with rust. But like I said, I don't have Photoshop. Grumble, grumble. So what I'm going to do, like I said, I'll show you some in Maya textures. So you can do a ramp, and you can just, there's different ways this can, you can sort of interpolate these, that just give you different effects. So if you have no interpolation, it basically just makes a really hard line. Could be good depending on what you need. In this case, I'm just going to set it to exponential up kind of randomly. And I'm just going to kind of go in here and just make some somewhat random values of this. And you can see that now we have this very awkward looking stripy ball, which looks really stupid, frankly. Actually, this might not be terrible, maybe for like tire tracks on a dirt road, question mark. But certainly looks silly for us. But also, ramp textures have these really fun attributes for noise, and you can see like the texture up here is changing. It's basically getting like really wiggly. So you can use noise to just break that up a little bit. You can also play with the frequency of the noise, just sort of like mess with the slider values to see exactly what's going on with this, and how that's sort of affecting your texture. So, like I said, I mean, this isn't what I would call super realistic. This is also not something, and I'm gonna stress this, for your textures, if you do want to do this for this week's assignment, use something better than a ramp. Like this, putting a random ramp texture like this on an object is not significantly better. Actually, it's not really any better than just slapping a random internet texture on. It's doing the same thing you should be making in Photoshop or some other editing software. Make actual targeted maps to put Rust or whatever you're doing in specific places. I would demo that. Like I said, I've not been able to contact Adobe in a way that they've been useful to me yet. But I'll get there. Anyway, so that's ramp textures. You can do some weird stuff with them. There's also noise textures. Buttons. Break that. Alright. Noise texture. So this is another one where I see a lot of people... Noise textures are very useful for some things. I see a lot of people using them for things that are perhaps... they'll just sort of slap a noise texture on it and be done with it, and it looks... Like, I can recognize default noise textures in Maya now. So be aware of that. Again, kind of the same thing as a ramp. Like, you don't just slap it on your object and call it a day. But you can also use this button here to sort of isolate the specific thing you're working on, which sometimes is helpful for like these black and white value things. Alright, so noise textures, there's a bunch of different settings. Honestly, I will usually just play with these randomly until I sort of figure out like what I like for this particular texture. They have a lot of times, you know, different weirds. This is like where they get really weird and kind of like blotchy and like look a little bit strange in my opinion. But there's a bunch of different settings you can play with. There's some fun stuff you can do with time for more of like an animation thing later. There's also different types of noise, so you can change to like Perlin noise, and just kind of like, oof, God. You can just sort of play with these and like see what they do, see which one maybe works better. This would probably make a pretty solid looking like magma kind of deal, if you did the right stuff to it. But anywho, so I'm gonna say maybe just the Perlin is probably fine for now. So just kind of like mess with these settings, see if they give you something you want or that you like. You can also do the repeat UV thing here if you want smaller noise. You can also do decibel values for this. So if you just want like larger noise, you could up those values. But that's going to give you also some kind of other blending between this as well. In this case, it's a little bit more subtle because the values are significantly more grayscale than they were previously. So I think the only other real thing that I want to say about noise textures is you can also map more stuff into this. So if you grab a ramp texture again, can you notice I am a crazy person for ramp textures? My God, why do I have so much stuff in here? Alright, so I'm going to grab the out color R and stick that for my noise and put it in the V coordinate for this ramp, and grab the apparently out color R from this ramp. The only thing that you should, I guess, sometimes it doesn't matter, sometimes it does, is if you're using R for the input and R for the output, they should be the same, because if you're putting in a R value and you're trying to pull a G value, it's going to be like, what are you doing? For black and whites, it doesn't matter so much, just like, not a bad habit to be in. Alright, so what we can do for this is basically push these values, again, similar to a level slider in Photoshop, but now we have something a little bit, hopefully, more randomized, a little bit, just like a different flavor, basically, of breaking up this texture than the noise. So that's honestly pretty much as I can demo this without Photoshop. But that is a thing where, again, if you guys do want to do this for your assignments this week, I have no problem with that. Just, again, make sure that you're mapping these textures with, like, custom file textures instead of, whatever weird default stuff that you're using in Maya, like I'm doing. So, just for fun, one more quick demo of this, where you can also use this for scratch textures, like if you want, paint scratched off down to metal. It's a convenient way of doing that if you are so inclined, where you can just make the paint texture and then make the metal texture, and then, did I put this in the wrong spot? What just happened here? You can make a paint texture and you can make a metal texture and then just basically map off where you want the metal texture, and it's really convenient sometimes. Question mark. Alright, and for some reason that's not uploading, so it seems like probably what I need to do is take the alpha's luminance button. Let's find out. That's under color balance, alpha's luminance, yep, cool. Alright, so that's more or less, like I said, mapping in these textures, just like a really quick version at the end of like doing it with the file texture, so you can kind of get the idea of like what you'd be going for. This will obviously take grayscale values, so if you want to have like a sort of faded area of rust, you can kind of do that, and it'll blend the values really nicely together. So that's honestly pretty much all I wanted to show you guys. Does anybody have a question on any of that texturing stuff before I pop into a super quick, I promised you neon signs. So before I pop into neon signs, anyone have any questions on this? Alright. Cool. Well, in that case, it's time for some neon. Mwahahaha. Alright, so let's just move this closer, just because it'll be a little bit more obvious what the heck is actually happening. Alright, so I'm going to make 2 versions of this neon sign. They're going to be really weird, and that's okay. Okay, so the first thing, there's basically 2 ways to make an object glow in Maya. And that is with emission on a standard surface shader like we've been using. So if we pop down, you'll notice this emission tab here, and I think I actually touched on this before, but let's just bust open our render view. Beautiful! Okay, so here's our very goofy emissive object. Actually, sorry, I should turn off this area light, because that's looking stupid. Alright, so here we have our lovely emissive object. You can also, if you're so inclined, change the texture of this at will. So, I mean, this will take basically default, you know, slider values. The other thing that I'm also very partial to doing for neon signs, again, not super realistic, but if you just throw a quickie planar map on this thing, and I'm actually not going to do anything else to the UVs, I'm going to apply a ramp texture to this, and make that blue and red or something. Let's see if this does. Nope. Alright, sometimes after you apply a new texture, you need to like restart the render view, which is annoying. Alright, so you can see that you can apply sort of just with a planar map and a ramp texture some really quick and easy coloring to this. You can also change the direction. If you switch this to U-ramp, it'll be more of like a horizontal kind of deal. So you can get as weird as you want with this, or as weird as you don't want. The only thing really to be aware of with these colors is that they will combine like regular lighting will. So basically, if you get all the colors of the spectrum together, they'll end up being white, basically. So certain colors are worse with that. Like, I think I was doing a test earlier, and like this will kind of go to white in the middle. So just a weird note, I guess, to be aware of. But, alright, so this is our lovely emissive light. If you want, you can also, I believe, set this up to values higher than 1, to make basically a more aggressive glow. There is also another option. I'm going to set this down to 1 for now. And that is making your light a mesh light. And the difference between mesh light and an emissive light, or like an emissive texture, is the mesh light is going to take longer to render, but create more realistic lighting. And what I'm going to do is, that's actually a thing where if you select your object, just come up to Arnold Lights and just click Mesh Light. So what that's it's going to do a few weird things by default. So for one, in your outliner, it's going to add this little light under the light itself. And if we give this a render, by default, it looks pretty gosh darn trashy. It might also be, again, I probably just need to re-update my stupid render thing. So there's a few different settings you can mess with. So one, I'm just going to set the exposure up to something really high, just so we know it's doing something. This is how I usually start doing lights. I'll put the slider value up to like 20 or 50 and then just like pull it back down because I feel like it's easier just to get the slider value you want. But again, totally personal preference. I'm going to, for the sake of being cohesive, map the same, do the same planar map I did on the light below. And where am I going? Oh my god. I'm gonna go into my light, and I'm gonna use the same color map I did from here. So the only way to grab that is to actually just go in your hypershade, again, under textures. Here's my lovely texture, and just dump that in the color channel. So just middle mouse dragging to get that in there. And then theoretically, we should have a multicolored mesh light of delight. Question mark. Yeah, rendering. Yeah, freezing. What are you doing? Give me a sec. Yes, good. It's multicolored now. Okay. Okay, that's very multicolored. Alright, so this is what we get by default, which is weird for a few reasons. One, there's no visible source of light. This is just a sort of weird aurora borealis effect on the wall. So there's some tick boxes for that. You can take this light visible thing, and ew. That's going to make the light itself emissive. So basically, like whatever object here you are using, or like the source of the light itself, if that makes sense, is going to be visible. So this is not actually the original mesh. If you want to show the original mesh, you have to click this Show Original Mesh button. And depending on the settings you choose, you're going to get some weird effects with this. The other thing to be aware of with mesh lights, in case this wasn't obvious from the render, is that by default, these do not smooth. So your mesh light is going to look at your object in whatever unsmoothed version it was in. So just be aware of that. If you did want to make, a nice smooth-looking mesh light, you would have to go in and do a mesh smooth on that light, which you should be able to do. And like once you smooth it, it's going to go through and sort of update the mesh light itself and go through and smooth that. So just be aware of that off the bat. But again, this behaves pretty much just like a regular light. So you do have all these normal attributes here. You'll notice this attribute for samples. And there's like I said, a few main differences for these. If you are just going for like a sort of generic neon glowy sign in like the back of somewhere, probably doing an emissive object is fine. For doing like a really small LED, like blinking somewhere, like, if you want to do like a controller button or something like that with an LED in it, a lot of times, unless you need that really, really bright, emissive objects are probably fine. Mesh lights you would want to use more if you're getting, like, if this neon sign is like really close in screen, if you need the light to be super crazy bright, you have more control over this mesh light. And then the other thing to be aware of is mesh lights take a really long time to render if you want the samples to not be grainy. It's kind of unavoidable, but if you do need the mesh light itself to be casting a very strong light, use a mesh light rather than emission. Because emission, it's still, like, it's basically cheating glow, where it's good for subtle things, but, like, if you make it super bright, it doesn't really behave the way a mesh light is going to behave. So just for the sake of, let's set our emission weight up to something really obnoxious, like 100. God, I actually have no idea what this is going to do. So you can see it's doing a nice job making it glow on the background, but it's not really throwing a lot of light into the scene. Whereas the mesh light was just like, here is light, and it just like exploded everywhere. So that's just like a weird kind of thing to kind of be aware of. I usually, like I said, if I'm trying to light a scene, I'll use a mesh light. If I'm just trying to get like a little glowy sign in the background, a lot of times I'll just use emission. So there's one or two other things I wanted to go over with this, but any questions so far? Alright, cool. Okay, so the other powerful thing, I'm just going to take this right the heck back down. The other powerful thing about mesh lights is you have a little bit more control over how they display, where like you'll notice that the brighter that I make this emission, at some point, like the object pretty much just becomes a solid color almost, which can look a little bit fake depending on what you're doing. So let me hide this and just get that out of the way. I will turn this very overexposed mesh light back on. So like I said, the nice thing about mesh lights is if you're like, okay, I want this to be really bright, but like obviously now this looks super flat and like, kind of weird and unrealistic, what you can do is turn off light visible, and this is where it gets a little bit weird. Turn on the original mesh, and a lot of times you also might need to turn off cast shadows, because basically what's happening here is you have a light nested or clipping through geometry, and then that geometry is hiding the mesh light, actual light. So if we turn off cast shadows, sometimes that'll get a little bit brighter. Just like a weird, sorry, wrong thing. Yeah, sorry about that. That's a thing. If you want to turn off the object from shadowing things, you can go in the Arnold tab and turn off cast shadows. But what you can do now is go in and actually assign that a normal texture like you would any other object, which I hope to God. Okay, cool. So that's actually going to be our surface shader 22, or the same thing that we used for the surface shader down here. And then what we can do is then go in and turn down emission slightly, but you get a little bit more control. So like you get all the benefits of a mesh light, where you have that really bright light being thrown into your scene, but you can go in and kind of like define a custom texture a little bit, where you can maybe tone down the brightness of the light itself, if that makes sense. Where it looks like the actual geometry looks a little bit less blown out and less flat. So it's just a weird sort of tidbit. There's a few other things you can do to that to like, you know, make it look a little different, but I think that's probably as in-depth as you'll ever need in this class for a light. People seem to be into neon signs, so I just wanted to do a quick neon sign demo. Also because emission might actually be useful for some of your stuff, and like for the final, like if you were doing, you know, a switch screen or something like that for your final, you can also map emission onto stuff. So like, for example, if I had a circle, actually, let's get weirder with it. Instead of a circle, let's assign a new material and make a glowing face. Okay, this is going to be a really ugly face. I'm just going to grab a scroll texture. Beautiful. Now we have a partially emissive face. I am actually going to invert this so we have glowing squiggles in the face. It seems more fun that way. And we're going to go ahead and render this. It's going to look really ridiculous. So the nice thing about this, like again, if you wanted to do, I need to check alpha's luminance. If you want, ooh, God. Clearly I've grabbed the wrong texture there. Anyway. But if you wanted to do, you know, glowing keyboard keys or anything like that, you could do that with a emissive map for those little keys. You can also make them a mesh light, but honestly that's overkill for anything like keyboard keys or like little phone lit keys. You can just do a thing here. And then you could also, if you wanted, again, put something in color, just like some, I don't know, some kind of random ramp texture with some random stuff in it, and you get instant glowing keys. So this is actually usually, it seems like I always have somebody doing like an RGB keyboard for their final. Doing something like this is actually how I usually recommend doing the keys, where if you lay out your keyboard in like a standard chord, if you UV your keys, lay out all the keys in a standard QWERTY setup, what you can do is basically just map in where you want to be emissive, and then just throw a generic ramp texture on that, and you get like automatic RGB gradient on your keyboard. So I think that's really all you guys should need to know for mission. Probably more than you guys should need to know for mission, but just, I don't know, making things glow is fun. So, anywho, that's pretty much that. That's actually really all I had for you guys this week. Does anybody have any other questions or want to go over anything before I let you guys go? All right. Well, couldn't you also make the letters? Yeah, so you could make the letters transparent, and do like an emissive light behind them. That's one of those things where you could do it. It's a little bit overkill for just like a light up keyboard. Especially because I got a fancy new RGB keyboard. Yeah, I mean, you could. That's one of those things where, like, if you were getting, like, really, really, really close to that keyboard, it might make sense to do that. But otherwise, like, just an emissive texture is probably fine. Yeah, you could. There's always two different ways to do stuff. It's just like it's kind of like the difference between bump and displacement. It's like, could you make everything a mesh light? Yeah. Is it overkill to do that all the time? Kind of. But it's not technically wrong. It just might take you longer to set up and longer to render. Um, but yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, in that case, I'm gonna let you guys go. Have a lovely week. If you have any questions texturing, just let me know. I'm just gonna I have another class at 3, but I'm just gonna kind of grade stuff till then. But if anyone wants to hang around for questions or like looking at specific models and stuff, I will be around. So if you're popping out, have a lovely week.
I share my